The first time we meet disability in thought, it often arrives like a riddle we did not expect. It collides with our assumptions about strength, independence, and the image of a fully able human being. Philosophy asks uncomfortable questions about value, identity, and the nature of a good life when different bodies and minds inhabit the world. Those questions matter because they shape policy, medicine, art, and how we imagine a life worth living. To begin, we must untangle two different stories about disability that have run side by side for centuries. The first story treats disability as a lack, a deviation from an invisible standard of normality that measures worth by certain abilities. The other story sees different abilities as inevitable variations in human life, with their own forms of knowing, adaptation, and value. These competing narratives shape how societies respond with medicine, architecture, education, and law. Philosophers from ancient to modern times have debated what makes a life valuable, and disability has always been a contested part of that debate. Some classical thinkers judged capability by physical strength and cognitive prowess, while others emphasized virtue, friendship, and communal ties as essential. The way we answer those questions reflects cultural priorities more than universal truths, and that revelation forces a humbling re-examination of our assumptions. Once humility enters the discussion, we open space for alternative ways of living and flourishing. One of the most important shifts in recent thinking is the social model of disability, which relocates the problem from individual bodies to society itself. According to this approach, barriers in architecture, attitudes, and institutions create disability more than any difference in a person's body or mind. This reframing turns the spotlight onto responsibility and design, asking whether we build environments that include or exclude, whether we recognize diverse needs, and whether we value all forms of human functioning. The implications ripple into law, urban planning, and everyday ethics. Language plays a powerful role in shaping how we think about difference, and the words we use carry moral weight. Terms that emphasize deficit reinforce stigma, while language that acknowledges diversity can open pathways to dignity and belonging. Changing language is not a cosmetic fix, but a practical step that affects policy, medical practice, and interpersonal respect. A small change in vocabulary can shift an entire network of expectations and rights. If society constructs many of the disabling barriers, then it follows that social change can create unexpected freedoms and possibilities. Ramps, captions, inclusive curricula, and attitudinal shifts can transform lives in concrete ways. But true transformation also requires rethinking deeper assumptions about productivity, normalcy, and worth. When a society values only one narrow form of success, it limits how everyone can contribute to a shared future. Philosophers who study meaning and purpose ask what makes a life worth living and how different abilities can contribute to a sense of meaning. For many people, meaning arises through relationships, creativity, care, and belonging, not merely through physical autonomy. Different abilities often amplify these sources of meaning because they require collaboration, vulnerability, and new kinds of insight. In the place where dependence and interdependence meet, we sometimes find the richest forms of human connection. Limitations can become creative constraints that spark innovation and adaptation in art, technology, and daily life. Every creative practice depends on limits that channel imagination into new forms, and disability often introduces unique constraints that lead to original solutions. From musicians who invent new techniques to designers who rethink interfaces, different abilities have produced inventions and aesthetics that reshape entire fields. Creativity thrives when necessity forces re-examination of what seemed fixed and inevitable. There are countless historical examples where so-called limitations reoriented entire disciplines and cultures, creating unexpected strengths. Consider how deaf communities developed rich visual languages and strong communal institutions that persisted for centuries. These developments remind us that adaptation is not merely survival, but a source of cultural wealth and innovation. When communities build around different abilities, they generate knowledge and practices that benefit everyone. The philosophy of adaptation asks how humans adjust physically, cognitively, and socially when circumstances change. Adaptation is not only biological, but also cultural, technological, and ethical, encompassing a wide range of human responses. Viewing adaptation as a moral achievement reframes disability as an arena of skill, resilience, and creativity rather than simple tragedy. This perspective invites admiration for strategies of survival and flourishing rather than pity or erasure. Technology has dramatically changed the landscape of ability, offering tools that extend perception, mobility, and communication in unprecedented ways. But technology is not a neutral fix. It reflects values and priorities of its creators. When assistive technologies are designed inclusively and equitably, they redistribute power and opportunity, transforming social structures and expectations. Conversely, exclusionary design reproduces inequality under a new guise. Often the most radical philosophical lesson from disability is humility about what counts as human excellence. Different abilities teach us that excellence can look like interdependence, attentiveness, and quiet courage rather than a solitary display of autonomy. This lesson has ethical consequences because it expands respect toward diverse practices of care, work, and creativity. Valuing varied excellence reshapes institutions in ways that make societies more humane. We also need to reckon with the danger of romanticizing disability as a source of moral purity or inspiration. Reductive tropes can be just as harmful as pity by erasing complexity and agency. A more mature philosophy holds space for both pain and strength, for mundane needs and extraordinary creativity, without simplifying any person into a single narrative. Complexity respects dignity and resists easy categorization. Intersectionality expands our philosophical lens by showing how disability interacts with race, gender, class, and geography to create different experiences of marginalization and resilience. Disability is never experienced in isolation from these other axes of identity. Acknowledging intersectionality forces us to design policies and practices that account for multiple layers of disadvantage and embodied expertise. It demands nuance rather than one-size-fits-all solutions. Public spaces and cultural narratives reveal how deeply social values shape the experience of ability, and how design choices either exclude or welcome people. The built environment can communicate worth by the degree to which it accommodates difference. Philosophy here matters because it articulates what inclusion entails beyond token gestures, pushing for substantive accessibility that transforms daily life for millions. Accessibility becomes a moral litmus test for civic values. Education is an arena where philosophical commitments translate into practical outcomes, shaping futures and opportunities. Inclusive education recognizes varied learning styles and provides resources so every student can develop their talents and voice. When education embraces difference, entire societies gain by unlocking blocked potential and creating citizens who understand diversity as a strength. The classroom becomes a crucible for democratic empathy and solidarity. Workplaces reflect our deepest assumptions about productivity and worth, and reframing disability in philosophical terms would reshape labor practices and expectations. Flexible roles, universal design, and equitable accommodations reveal hidden talents and promote dignity at work. A society that broadens its definition of contribution benefits from creativity and loyalty, often found in diverse workforces. Employment equity is not charity, but smart social investment grounded in ethical reasoning. Art often captures the philosophical heart of disability by making the invisible visible and creating spaces for alternative narratives to flourish. Artists with different abilities transform audiences by presenting perspectives that challenge conventional perceptions. Artistic practices can critique, celebrate, and complicate our understanding of ability in ways that clinical or academic language sometimes cannot. This aesthetic dimension is an essential part of collective philosophical reflection. Everyday ethics emerges when ordinary people make small decisions that either include or exclude others in their communities, and these choices reveal moral priorities. Accessibility is not only about infrastructure, but about how we listen, wait, and make space for difference. When neighbors, friends, and strangers choose curiosity over judgment, they participate in a moral practice that reshapes culture in lasting ways. Everyday gestures accumulate into public ethics through repeated acts of recognition. There is also a political philosophy at work when disability rights movements demand recognition, representation, and redistribution of resources. These movements frame disability as a justice issue that challenges existing power structures. Rights-based approaches insist that dignity requires structural change, not merely charity or pity. And this insistence reshapes how democracies allocate care, education, and access. Political philosophy gives a vocabulary to those demands. Ethical dilemmas often arise in medical settings when prognoses, quality of life judgments, and resource allocation collide with deeply personal values. Philosophy provides tools to navigate these dilemmas by clarifying values, trade-offs, and the limits of prediction. A humane approach to medicine respects patients' narratives and the plurality of possible good lives, resisting reductionist calculations that ignore subjective meaning and social context. Care becomes an ethical conversation as much as a technical one. Relational philosophies emphasize that identity is formed in networks of care, dependency, and mutual recognition, which challenges the solitary heroism ideal common in Western thought. Different abilities foreground the relational nature of human existence in stark and illuminating ways. This reframing suggests that policies and ethics should focus on sustaining relationships and ensuring mutual flourishing rather than maximizing isolated autonomy. It is a shift from abstraction to lived interdependence. What does a society that truly values all forms of human experience look like, and how do we move toward it? The answer is incremental and political, requiring small reforms, cultural conversations, and a reimagining of public goods. Philosophy helps by providing principles and frameworks that guide those reforms. By reminding us why dignity matters, and by offering a language to imagine inclusive futures, the work is practical and aspirational at once. There are difficult trade-offs and painful histories that cannot be ignored if we aim for justice, and any honest philosophy must confront them directly. From segregationist policies to medical abuses, the past shapes present distrust and structural barriers. Facing these histories requires accountability, reparative measures, and ongoing dialogue that centers those most affected. This process is demanding, but it is necessary for building genuine inclusion and trust. If different abilities can teach us anything, it is that human flourishing is plural, messy, and relational rather than uniform and isolated. Philosophical openness to plurality protects against the arrogance of one-size-fits-all ideals. This insight invites a radical humility about expertise and a democratic faith in ordinary people's capacity to shape just arrangements. It reframes disability not as a problem to fix, but as a perspective to learn from. As we look to the future, technology, law, and culture will continue to reshape what different abilities mean in practice. The challenge before us is to choose designs and policies that amplify dignity, autonomy, and mutual care. That choice is ultimately ethical and philosophical, because it reflects who we think we are and who we want to become as a collective. The future will be defined by those value-driven choices. The philosophical twist at the end is this: Limitation often becomes the lens through which humans see more clearly what matters. Different abilities sharpen appreciation for relationships, art, patience, and moral imagination in ways unexplainable by utility alone. If we allow that lesson to sink in, our institutions and hearts will change together, producing societies where difference is not feared but learned from. That is a quieter kind of revolution and a deeper triumph of human wisdom. Every philosophy ends with action if it is honest, and the call here is simple but profound: design, legislate, educate, and care with the presumption of dignity for all. Those actions will translate philosophical commitments into lived realities that honor varied human experiences. If this exploration changed your perspective even a little, lean into the conversation by reading more, listening to affected communities, and demanding accessibility as a baseline. Small moral habits accumulate into social justice over time. Thank you for following this exploration of the philosophy of disability and different abilities, and for staying curious about what it means to live well together. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe and join the conversation about dignity, design, and care. The work continues in communities, classrooms, and legislatures, and every committed listener can be part of that transformation. See you next time with another story that changes how we think about being human.